All right. Welcome. Happy Friday, everybody. I guess everyone can hear us now. Today's morning session is on environmental and historic preservation. We have two presenters, Ava Martin and Heather Feil, and we will have them present, and then we'll save all the questions for the very end, the Q&A and discussion for the end. Ava Martin's going to go first. She's a senior at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. She's majoring in history, minoring in anthropology, and she is also beginning as an intern with the Alaska State Historic Preservation Office. Her paper draws on her year of study abroad in Scotland, and she is the recipient of Alaska Historical Society's Terence Cole Student and Beginning Professional Award this year. And so I will go ahead and hand it off to Ava.
Thank you so much, Eric. Let me just pull up my screen here. Okay. So hi, everyone. As I said, my name is Ava Martin, and I am a fourth-year student at UAA. I have a little bit of experience in historic preservation. I have worked for Katie Ringsmith for the Naknek Cannery History Project, and I've also worked for Northern Bedrock Historic Preservation Corps.
Sorry, Ava, to interrupt. I don't know if you need to hit like a final confirm or share or whatever, but we're not seeing your screen.
Oh, is it not? Okay. Thank you for letting me know. Let's see. Okay. Right. Is it coming through now?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Yes, so now that you can see my screen, what I'm going to be talking about today has to do with my time studying abroad at the University of Stirling, and I was taking classes from their Heritage and Tourism degree. But a little disclaimer first is I am very new to all this, and I don't want to be telling experienced professionals stuff that you already know, but I am hoping to give you a fresh perspective on from my experience in another country in Scotland and as a young person new to this field. When I first moved to Scotland, I was surprised by how many similarities there were. And there were small things like magpies and fireweed, which they call willow herb, to the latitudes. Anchorage is 61 degrees north, and the Orkney Islands at the very tip of the Scottish mainland are 59 degrees north. So it's pretty similar. And then we both have a fairly rural or low population compared to the center of power, DC and London, which can lead to a misunderstanding of our needs, specifically regarding our historic environment. In both places, there are a lot of organizations that work together to preserve and protect the historic environment. In Alaska, we have on the federal level, the National Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management, many different departments, federal preservation officers, and the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation. On the national level, there's also the National Trust for Historic Preservation in the private sector. Here in the state, the heading up preservation efforts is the Office of History and Archaeology, along with the State Historic Preservation Office. They're aided by the Alaska Historical Commission. And then privately, there's the Alaska Historical Society and many different local historical societies. We also have a program called Certified Local Governments, where the Office of History and Archaeology aids communities in creating their own historic site inventories and creating regulations for historic preservation and getting funding for those projects. In Scotland, there's significantly fewer national organizations. The main ones are Historic Environment Scotland, or HES, and the National Trust for Scotland. On the local level, there's plenty of small historical societies and museums, community trusts, and local authorities, which are also town governments who often make the decisions on what renovations are allowed in historic buildings. Practically, these organizations manage the historic environment through a variety of regulations. And in Alaska, we have Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. And this is put into practice through the National Register of Historic Sites, where places can be listed and recognized and receive funding. There's also the Alaska Landmark Register, and both Alaska and Scotland have UNESCO World Heritage Sites. In Scotland, there is a system referred to as designations, where sites can be scheduled, listed on the inventory of battlefields or the inventory of gardens and designed landscapes. Scheduling is for monuments and archaeological sites, and those are all considered to have national importance. Whereas listing is for historic buildings, and there's categories A, B, and C, where A is outstanding importance to the nation, whereas C is it's just a good representation of that style or era. All of these records are housed in Canmore, an online database, and they're searchable through designations map search, which these are what the photos are of. You can take a map of Scotland and zoom in, and then the designations are indicated by the dots and lines, and you can click on these and then they connect to Canmore. Alaska also has an online database called Alaska Heritage Resource Survey, but to prevent looting, it is accessible only to qualified cultural resource professionals. And it's this issue of accessibility that brings me to the part where I think Alaska has the most to learn from Scotland. It's this brand that they have created for themselves. Historic Environment Scotland is actually a pretty new, streamlined organization. Before 2015, it used to be Historic Scotland and the Royal Commission on Ancient and Historical Monuments in Scotland. But they merged and have created this new brand for themselves. They have a new logo, and it's very recognizable, simple, but common and consistent. And any new signs, sites, merchandise, publications, websites, everything has this logo on it. And it makes it really obvious which things are from them. You can see here at the top, this is their main logo with Historic Environment Scotland in English and Gaelic. And then most of these are from them. The Drat sign and the Birthplace of a Genius sign are both National Trust sites, and they have a different logo. But having these colors, the fonts, the logo, makes it really obvious who is in charge and who to go to if you have questions, which is helpful as a interested professional or just a curious individual who wants to know more, or a property owner with a historic site, whether that's a building, an archaeological site. There's very clear tabs on advice and support, and lots of publications on what to do and who to go to. Whereas sometimes in Alaska, it can be a little bit confusing who to go to. There's a lot of different organizations with different logos and different websites, and trying to know who is in charge of what and who to ask questions of can be confusing. And I say this as someone who's, this is something I'm really interested in, and sometimes I've found it difficult to find out information that even in my past few weeks at the OHA, I have discovered things that I wasn't able to find before. But something that both places find very important and place a lot of value on is community involvement. And in Alaska, the instance that comes right to mind is Kodiak's Alutiiq Museum Community Archaeology Project. And what better way to get the public interested in their heritage and historic preservation than allowing them to participate in it. And in Kodiak, anyone and everyone, no matter your education or experience, it was allowed to come and dig with archaeologists. And this is a way for people to see what research is happening and to take pride in being able to help with it. In Scotland, they have had some difficulties with amateur metal detector groups, claiming to be aiding archaeologists by digging up sites that that they may or may not give the artifacts to museums. And Scotland is really encouraging metal detectorists to work with archaeologists so that they can discover more things together and in responsible ways that don't damage the information that can be found in sites. Another way to involve your community is to educate them. And this is something I really appreciated in Scotland. I mean, one of the main attractants to me to go was the Heritage and Tourism degree that the University of Stirling offered. And I was able to take professional skills training in historic preservation and museums. And it's a way for them to give university level training to people who live nearby or from far away so that they're prepared for the jobs that are available there. In Alaska, so far we have had programs in anthropology and history, but a really huge need for public history historians, for people in historic preservation and heritage, but not necessarily the university level programs. However, Dr. Ian Hartman and others are working on a master's program at UAA in Alaska tourism and cultural heritage, which is so exciting because there are so many job opportunities here and a need for our vast state to have qualified professionals in these areas. This is the sort of program that I wished existed when I started at UAA, and I am so happy that it is in the works. And now actually I forgot about this. These are some of the coursework assignments that I had in Scotland. This is for the heritage class where we focused on learning about historic environment Scotland. And we were assigned to go to this old church and to draw a plan of it. We were supposed to find these special grave markers and indicate on the map where they were located. And then in another class, we were instructed in designing a museum exhibit, which we needed to research from local archives. Both Alaska and Scotland have long-term strategies for the historic environment. The OHA has Saving Our Past, Planning for Our Future. And I really appreciate in this document that there is an argument given for why our history is so important and why historic preservation matters in Alaska. And it talks about Alaska's economy and our dependence on tourism, the benefit of heritage to that. Scotland has Our Place in Time, which you could argue is more user-friendly because it's significantly shorter, so faster to read, but it does not have all the information on why Scotland will benefit from the historic environment and historic preservation. But it could be because some of that is already understood in Scotland, maybe because they have focused on heritage tourism. Almost half of the people who go to visit Scotland say that they are going to visit a historic site. Historic Environment Scotland alone had over 41.6 million pounds of commercial income annually, which is about 47 million. And then in 2014, the historic environment in general was estimated to contribute in excess of 2.3 billion, or about pounds, or about $3.8 billion to Scotland's national gross value. And so it shows that not only is the historic environment valuable to the locals for their own enjoyment, but also for their economy. And I think this is somewhere that maybe Alaska's history can be misunderstood. This might just be a UK thing, but as someone coming from Alaska to Scotland, I was often teased about how short the history here is. Saying things like, oh, this, building down the street is older than your country and stuff like that. But you might not be able to see castles and thousands of year old stone ruins as you look around. But that does not mean that our landscape isn't full of history. We have some of the oldest archaeological sites in the Americas. This is a really important place for research and learning about human migration from Siberia to the Americas, which is something that affects the whole world. Learning about where we came from and how we got here. Tourism is really important in Alaska. But the tourists, they come for more than mountains and seafood. They come for thousands of years old atlatls, for microblaze, for remote Russian Orthodox churches, for gold rush towns and canneries. We need the world to know how important our history is and prevalent it is, so that we can benefit economically. It will benefit them in the beauty and learning that they can have coming here, and the effect on their identity it can have with these archaeological sites. And then we need our communities to know, so that they can help preserve their identity. We all know how important history is, and to preserve these tangible aspects is really crucial. It gives a sense of place, and it gives our communities pride in contributing to its preservation. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was excellent, Ava. Thank you so much. It's always nice to have a fresh and international perspective on historic preservation. And I don't think I introduced myself earlier to the as part of the panel, but I work as a historian at the National Park Service, and at one point I was an intern, and fully realized some of these points you brought up about the complexity of the people that are taking care of historic preservation in the United States and in Alaska, and how it often is just weaved in many different directions. Yeah, I love the presentation. We're gonna move over to Heather Feil. Heather is she started working for the Park Service in 2003, and she holds a variety of cultural resource positions she's held a variety of cultural resource positions across the country, from the Great Smoky Mountains to Golden Gate National Recreation Area. She's been an architectural historian for the Alaska Regional Office since 2010, where she writes about old buildings and advocates for their preservation while getting people excited about their history and telling all of the American stories through the built environment. And so I'm going to turn it over to Heather now.
Great. Can you guys see my screen? Am I muted?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes,
okay.
I can see it.
Awesome. Great. Yeah, Ava, I want to just start off by saying I'm also a historian with the National Park Service, and I also started out as an intern. Welcome into the fold. We love brand new perspectives, and I hope to talk to you more. But to jump into this conversation, here's to preserve unimpaired, the evolution of the Alaska's national parks. And when I jumped in and put in a description of what I wanted to talk about, I realized this was probably going to be a little bit longer than I anticipated. But to start, I want to start to say that I live and work on the land of the Dinaina, and then we'll jump into it. Our objectives today are understanding the evolving background of the National Park Service, discussion of what's kind of considered to be our dual mandate, evolution of the NPS sites in Alaska. We're going to look at one specific site in particular, Mount McKinley to Denali, and how to balance the mission of the NPS in the future. And I just want to acknowledge that coming into this conversation, I'm kind of making two assumptions about the audience, and it's really bizarre that I can't see you. But I'm going to assume that you have been to a site that's been managed by the National Park System. And I'm also going to assume that you might not be as much of a National Park Service nerd as I am. So hopefully we're going to discover some new things together. To set the stage, though, it is important to note that all parklands are ancestral homelands of Indigenous people. We need to acknowledge those who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and recognize their continued connection to the land, water, and community. We need to pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. The NPS is entrusted with the management of over 85 million acres of federal lands and waters that are the ancestral homelands of Indian and Alaska Native tribes and Native Hawaiians that predate the National Park System. As stewards, we are entrusted to conserve these resources for future generations, including resources, sites, and vistas that hold significance to Indigenous peoples who have lived on or cared for the land since time immemorial. So in the discussion about the National Park Service, you might have heard that we were established through the Organic Act of 1916. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start looking at this law that establishes us as an agency and a bureau of the Department of Interior. But the key piece is that we did not come out of the gate in the form of which you know us now. But we're going to kind of dive into this a little bit more. We're going to look at how looking at conserving, and we're conserving things unimpaired. And a couple key things being, focus, this is a law. So lawyers love to pick apart meanings of words, right? So just highlighting a couple of those things. Right in that first sentence, we're promoting these lands. We're regulating the use of these federal lands, right? And then the one little quick thing I wanted to add is this, which purpose is to conserve the scenery and natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner that by such means will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. And it's just a fun little, because again, words matter in law. Wildlife means both flora and fauna because it's two words, not one. All right, so a lot of people consider that paragraph to give us a dual mandate, a balancing act of conserving and enjoying, and how you can't do one. Maybe we focus on one and maybe we focus on the other. And I just want to pitch that it is a true balancing act. We have conservation on one side, we're providing for enjoyment of the American people on the other side. But really the key stressor in all of that paragraph is rooting in unimpairment. So the fundamental purpose is really singular. It's not dual, it's not conservation and use, but it's rather a single purpose that includes conservation and enjoyment, and most importantly, subject to the impairment prohibition. And while enjoying the parks, you might not have necessarily seen the impacts, but when we have to manage resources, there's a development aspect to be able to conserve an area, and we're going to dive into this. So in order to develop some things, to provide that access, we're actually providing protections for resources to not get trammeled and overused. And so if you've ever been up Mount Bali, like in Eagle River, obviously that's not Park Service, but in the last 10 years, people would just take the quickest route up, right? And so we have a lot of social trails, and it results in a lot of erosion. And in the last 5 years, they've developed a hardened trail that then preserves the mountain for longer use. It's kind of that idea. And as much as I don't necessarily want this to be a discussion about law, it's a really important thing to have a discussion about law and the different things that have guided us over the 106-year plus history of the National Park System. All right. We're going to start off with the first one out the gate. When Yellowstone National Park was established in 1872. To set the stage, thousands of people are moving west, just ravaging the landscape, taking from it whatever they can in the opportunity to make money and to provide for more land. Enough people advocated to Congress to say that Yellowstone's a special place. It should be set aside. And we hadn't done this before as a nation. We hadn't set aside land just to become a national parkscape. But eventually Congress does act, and in 1872, set aside that land for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. But that's all that happened. They set aside the land. There was no rules for management, and more importantly, no funds. It was just a block on the map that said, this is now a special place. By 1902, we already have our first vehicle that arrives to Grand Canyon. It's a Toledo steamer, if you're curious. But so people want to see these places. They want to interact with these places. But then how do you manage that action? By 1906, President Roosevelt signs the Antiquities Act, and he uses it to protect all sorts of land. And some of that would later become the Grand Canyon and Olympic. By 1916, we finally decided that maybe we should have an agency that manages these new national parks. And the Organic Act that we just discussed was signed, creates the agency. But again, with that establishment of the national parks, we still don't have management actions. In 1918, what's called the Lane Letter, who was the Secretary of Interior Lane at the time, he wrote a 5-page letter that described out how the park should be managed and what's appropriate for parks, what's not appropriate for parks. And this is our initial management policies. And it's so popular that subsequent Secretary of Interiors write a similar letter soon after they arrive to office to kind of adjust their vision for the national parks and what the priorities are. By 1933, our second director of the National Park System is kind of playing the tables in Washington, and he sees the role of the National Park Service as something that should be expanded. We have all these big landscapes out west. We're preserving these landscapes, but maybe we should be the one to tell all of America's stories. And he sees that there's other departments that are managing things that maybe should be in the National Park System's purview. So in this executive order signed in 1933, there was a lot of different arrangements of the executive branch, but the one thing that mattered for the National Park Service was that we now took over the battlefield parks from the War Department, so Civil War era along the East Coast. It reassigned a lot of the different monuments that had just been kind of assigned to whatever land management agency had been around at the time. We took on ownership of national cemeteries, and it actually briefly for a year changed our name to the Office of National Parks, Buildings, and Reservations. And I, for one, am really glad that that was only a year-long name. It doesn't have the same ring, I don't think. So to give it perspective, here's a map of the United States in 1915, right before the National Park Service gets established. And you can see where a lot of this conservation effort is happening. It's all out west. There's nothing on the eastern seaboard. And to counter that to the population density of the United States in 1910, here that is. So it's very clear that we're preserving or setting aside this land in the opportunity to help it survive the population that might be coming, which is interesting. So here's a map from 1934 when we start to add all those monuments in. We're starting to add a little bit more. We pivot and we have the Historic Sites Act of 1935 that allows us to kind of take into the fold historic-based stories. And so you'll see along the coast, there's George Washington's birthplace, a national monument that gets added, colonial national monument that gets added. So it's a lot of the colonial heritage of the nation. We're starting to figure out maybe we should be setting that aside as an important story we want to tell or not. And so those things come into the fold as something slightly different. And so it's declared as a national policy to preserve for public use historic sites, buildings, and objects of national significance for the inspiration and benefit of the people of the United States. It basically solidifies and expands the effort of that executive order we just talked about. Coming up next, by 1936, we get another title to the fold. We get our first national recreation area. Lake Mead, when the Hoover Dam was completed, we now have a new flavor of National Park Service site. In 1945, the post-war baby boom slams the national park system with millions of new visitors and completely taxes the system. Again, because if we have not been able to provide infrastructure for people to access the system in a way that preserves the resources, and the last time we really had funding, which we didn't really get into this presentation, was the New Deal era for CCC. We're not prepared for all these cars coming into the landscape. By 1955, the new director of the system, Conrad Worth, he doesn't want to do a piecemeal operation of the national parks to improve the infrastructure. He wants one big ask of Congress, and he made a pitch to President Eisenhower, called it Mission 66, because in 1966 would be our 50th anniversary of the Park Service. And he requests that we need to do something different in the Park Service. We need to be able to prepare better for all these visitors that are coming by car. They're no longer coming by railroad or wagon. They're coming specifically by personal car. And we need to do something about how to accommodate them. And so he's asking for two different pots of money. One is for building up that visitor infrastructure to then help preserve the resource. And the other is actually to help build up the administrative side, to give rangers a place to sleep at night, to have offices to work out of, to have maintenance yards. It was a holistic game changer of the national park system. Previous to Mission 66, we didn't have visitor centers. Visitor centers was an invention of this pitch and a change up of the use. So you would then drive your car to the visitor center, get out, experience the orientation provided to you at the visitor center, and then be able to be released onto the lands of the park to then go experience it. So again, without Mission 66, we would not be the Park Service that we know and love today, and the orientation that we're still provided with today. And we're still learning and growing. We're trying to figure out who we are and what we should be doing in that preserving unimpaired. We relied really heavily on maybe trying to change up how we manage wildlife populations in our first 50 years. And then we had a couple of biologists that came through our ranks, ending in this wildlife management in the national parks, which we lovingly call the Leopold Report. And it calls for us to manage our parks at the ecosystem level and restore that native ecosystem. Because previous to this time, early on in our timeline of the NPS, we would bear bait bears so people could watch them from their cars. We would kill wolves to then make sure that there was enough ungulates for people to ooh and ah at. We weren't managing at a ecosystem level. And I don't think that people are necessarily aware of that. There's a lot of different changes that are obviously happening nationally in the 60s. We're kind of changing how we want to view ourselves as a nation. There's a couple other things that are coming down the pike that are super important. So by 1964, President Johnson signs the Wilderness Act, which is incredibly important for Alaska, and we'll get into that. All right, I know it's a lot of history, but we're going to get there. So by 1966, we also have the National Historic Preservation Act, which honestly gives me my job, and again, changes up the focus a little bit for what we're supposed to be doing as the federal government and also as what we're supposed to be doing as the national park system. And just a few years later, in 1970, we have kind of the second authority for coming into what the National Park Service stands for. And so we've had 60 years of experience. We've grown a lot as an agency. We have that short paragraph that we kind of go back to for the Organic Act. But now we've grown. We've added all these different things into the fold. We've basically added 3 different types of Park Service site. We've had the big P parks, and then we've had monuments, which can be historic or natural. And then we have these recreation areas, and we kind of manage them with 3 different sets of rules because we saw them differently. And then in 1970, Congress said, no, you can't manage them with different rules. We're telling all of America's stories with this whole portfolio, and we need to keep it all on the same level. But then to continue that route in 1972, we start to add more recreation areas into the fold, specifically in urban environments. And so it's our first time that we really look into equity of providing access for anyone who might have been in only in an urban environment, never had an opportunity to go out and see Yosemite or Yellowstone or Grand Canyon, but still be able to provide for them some type of specific NPS access. And so the first two out the gate are Gateway in New York City and Golden Gate in San Francisco. And we've added many more since then. One more qualifier, again, like we're trying to still figure out who we are. 1978, we have what's called the Redwoods Act or the Redwoods Amendment, in which Redwoods National Monument gets expanded. And it gets expanded because there's been a decimation of logging industry around what was conserved for the Redwoods Act. And it explicitly advises Congress to look to adjust boundaries of the NPS to prevent impairment of resources. So that gives us another little qualifier. And again, at the ecosystem level, 1988, the Yellowstone fire, which took out 30% of the forests of Yellowstone, it really helped us to then look to and change the conversation topic about fire's role in the ecosystem, and still does to this day. But as we were talking about Mission 66 and building up infrastructure so we can then protect the resources and still provide access, if you build up infrastructure but don't maintain infrastructure, you end up with what we had until this last year called deferred maintenance. And so by 2008, we have a backlog of deferred maintenance, meaning just like stuff we couldn't quite get to with the budget that we had, roofs that needed to be redone, roads that needed to be repaved, things like that, of $10 billion. And the other piece of all of this is that by 2020, we still hadn't stopped adding new park units. So by 2020, the last unit that's been added to the park system to date was the Medgar and Merle Ivers Home National Monument, and that is the 423rd unit of the National Park System. So I know I've thrown a lot of different names into the portfolio of what the Park Service is responsible for. So let's just take a look at that. The great thing is that if you're confused, it's even better because Congress is confused, because this is only half of them. So here's the rest. So National Park, National Battlefield Site, National Historical Park, National Historic Site. There's all these different flavors of things that are underneath the umbrella of the National Park System. And again, they're all equal now. Big P parks are no longer higher level than the rest of them. They're all equal. We're all here to tell all of America's stories. And we do that through a hierarchy of authorities. I mean, we're a federal entity, and that's just how that works. So of course, we're rooted in the Constitution, and then all those public laws we went over with executive orders, which we kind of touched on, all the way down to how we manage on the daily, which is initially those Secretary of Interior letters, which then became our management policies. And through the last round of management policies in 2006, we've qualified our mission to be this. So the National Park Service preserves, which we've changed up the word a little bit, and that's okay, unimpaired, the natural and cultural resources and values of the National Park System for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. We also added that we can't do it alone. We're going to partner with partners to extend those benefits outside of what we can do in the parks and also all around the world. So this is our new mission statement. This is what we manage under the shared stewardship mission of the National Park System. But I promised you Alaska, so let's get into Alaska. All right, so this is one of my favorite maps, pre-ANILCA maps of the national parklands in Alaska. But again, even though y'all are practitioners in Alaska, we have to start with land law. So we're going to start with the sale, of course, of Alaska from Russia, and then coming into the Second Organic Act that establishes Alaska as a territory in 1912, which gives us territorial rights. And of course, we were really impacted by World War II by the 1942, all those substantial impacts that happened here. And then we were able to prove our worth, basically. By 59, we become a state. Once you become a state, you also are allotted a certain amount of land to then function as a state. And this goes all the way back to land laws back in England. And so we had to figure out who owned what, because at the time, Alaska was 95% federal. And you can't function as a state with 5% of land. We weren't really in a hurry, unfortunately, until the commercial quantities of oil were discovered on the North Slope. And we needed to get those commercial quantities of oil to market. So we're trying to figure out how to do that. And it was a hot mess. And the Secretary of Interior at the time in 1969 finally did a land freeze to tell us to figure it out. So pause, you can't build this. Y'all need to figure out who owns what, which again, as we've discussed throughout this whole conference, leads to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act in 1971, which I wish we could go into more here, but and then by 1977, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System is completed. And then shortly on the heels of all of that, for a variety of reasons, a NILCA was signed that doubled the acreage of the national park system just by signing this one piece of legislation. Yeah. So it's conserves millions of acres of land. It also it protects interests in a different way compared to the parks in the lower 48, and it was set aside to be something slightly different. So let's go into an example, right? So evolution of Denali National Park and Preserve. Parks get established in basically two manners. Either the president says you're special and uses the Antiquities Act and establishes you with a law, with a declaration that says why you're special, or Congress says this land is special. And so we call either one of those things the enabling legislation of a park, and that is what we manage to. It's why this place on the earth is special and what we need to be then preserving unimpaired, right? So we're going to start here and just say McKinley National Park was established by 1917. Mostly for these guys here because they're so tasty. But we can establish the land just like in Yellowstone. We can establish and say like this place is special, but then how do we manage for that place? And really up here for Mount McKinley, we didn't really have too many concerns until we start providing access. So 1923, the Alaska Railroad is completed, which again starts providing access, right? And so if you were well-to-do and had enough equity, you could then go and get on a steamer ship in Seattle, take your car with you, right? Get off in Seward, put your car on the Alaska Railroad, take your car up to Mount McKinley Park Station and take it off and enjoy the park. So in order to help enjoy that park, the Alaska Road Commission completes a road from the McKinley Park Station all the way to Kantishna between 1923 and 1938. It took a little bit of time. And then, of course, the Alcan gets completed in 1942. And so now, again, you had to be a little bit hardy to be able to make this work, but you can get a car, well, to Fairbanks and then get on the Alaska Railroad that way. There's still no connection. But then in 1957, the Alaska Highway gets completed. And so now there is an actual physical connection that you can get on the road system between the lower 48 and Denali. And this is when the management issues start to really arise in Denali, of how we're supposed to manage and help preserve the resource, but also provide people access and enjoyment. And it really gets problematic in 1972 when the George Park Highway gets completed. And then we implement the second shuttle system in the entire national park system to then balance out this access and enjoyment and preserve an impaired ideal. And then, of course, by 1980, we double the size of the park, and we changed the name to Denali National Park and Preserve, which again was all established through ANILCA. But let's take a look at those two different enabling legislations, because now we've talked about two. We have the initial one for when Mount McKinley was set aside as a special place on the earth, and it's really just set aside a public park for the benefit and enjoyment of the people under the name of Mount McKinley. And then there's a second piece about it being a game refuge, and that the secretary is going to come along and figure out what that means later. So that's why this spot on the earth was important. And then 1980, here's the expansion. So here's the original district. Here's the original boundaries of the park and how it got expanded in ANILCA. And so now we're looking at things like we're protecting and interpreting the entire mountain massive and the additional scenic mountain peaks and formations to protect the habitat and population of all these wonderful animals and continue those opportunities for reasonable access for mountain climbing, mountaineering, and other wilderness recreation activities. So again, like we've added a little bit more language to the enabling legislation, but it is styling down in, we're preserving, we're protecting, and we're still allowing for enjoying, because that's the balancing act that we're in. But so if you're a manager of the national park system, within the national park system, how do you then balance preservation and recreation? So in order to kind of walk us through this, we're going to focus on one resource, really, the Mount McKinley Park Road. So beginning in 1923, rock was blasted and gravel was removed to start creating this park road, which ends up being a 92-mile ribbon of road winding west from the park entrance all the way to Kantishna. That was completed in 1938. So from its inception, the park road was to provide the primary access to the park. And if you've been on the park road, which I'm hoping that you have, it makes transitions of road character as you continue along it. Because again, the road is learned over time, and we've slightly changed how we perceive the road over time. But the road improvement story is an example of a challenge faced by all national parks, balancing the need to protect park resources while making those resources available for people to enjoy. And then in the 1950s, as we're gearing up for Mission 66, and this is coming along again to help people peruse the parks with their cars, basically in a controlled manner in the lower 48, there comes to be some key questions up here in Alaska, where we have a wildlife park biologist over here, Adolf Murie, and there's his half-brother Olaf. They were very excited about conservation, and they started to ask some other questions. In Alaska, should we provide a different level of experience? Should we provide a roadless wilderness for people to interact with? Should that be our inherent mission? And so Adolf Murie said that the wilderness standards in McKinley must be maintained on a higher level than anything we've attempted in the States, mostly because we have this opportunity. We have this opportunity to maybe think about things a little bit differently, not be able to do exactly what's going on in the lower 48, where they infer that they're building highways into parks, which wasn't necessarily the case, but it got the right people to the table to have a discussion. And they're not without merit to have this kind of concern. We're going to look really briefly in Yosemite. The Tioga Road in Yosemite was initially this mining road that was very rickety. People would never want to drive it. But through Mission 66, and without the consultation of the Sierra Club, the National Park Service busted out some of those pieces of those granite domes to create a hardened road to, again, provide for access, again, trying to balance access and resource preservation. And we might have missed the mark here. The symbol of Mission 66 across the country, especially in conservation circles, starts to become the bulldozer. And at the same time, there's a twin program within the Forest Service called Operation Outdoors. The director at the time, he was consulting with a lot of different entities to figure out what we needed to do for Mission 66. But he was focused more on that promote aspect of the original mission statement. And he was looking to the Phillips Petroleum Company for partnerships. He was looking to the American Automobile Association to figure out what they were seeing as the needs. He wasn't necessarily talking to the Sierra Clubs of the world. And this push continued on to be fought in editorials and letters to a variety of people, including there was a whole National Parks magazine that was dedicated to the idea of roads in national parks. And Olaf, half-brother of Adolf, said that there should be poet's grace even in road building. And I just love that quote. Adolf retires from the National Park System, and he then starts just to go to write about why this place is important and why maybe we should be looking at this slightly differently. And it is key to note that Adolf is really one of the main biologists that started to pivot our understanding of how we should be managing at the ecosystem level. He really studied the wolves of McKinley and figured out how having them in the ecosystem was beneficial and not detrimental, because in the early years of this park, you could read through the superintendent's monthly reports to say how excited they were when they took out more wolves to preserve the caribou population. So throughout all this conversation, it does stop that new construction on the park road, and we end up in that time with something that's called the telescoping road. And so if you've been on the road, it kind of changes its quality of road as you go further out. So at the front country, you're looking at a macadam blacktop road. The second section, it was widened to be a blacktop road, but it didn't get paved because of all the controversy we just talked about. And then past Teklanika, it even gets skinnier. And then past Eielson, it gets even skinnier. And it becomes what we call a rustic road phase 3 for the National Park Service. So we provided this road. We've made it a little bit hardened. We widened it in some places. We're providing for more safety, because you can't just provide access without looking to safety of the visitors, right? And looking in 1967, so previous to the Parks Highway, This is what the park road looked like around Stony Overlook. So these are people who are taking a vehicle up the Denali Highway and getting into the park. And it's being overrun, for lack of a better term. There's a lot of impacts. You can see a lot of tire gouges out in different areas. This isn't quite what the look of resource protection is, right, for the national park system. And it comes to the national attention as we were talking about the Parks Highway coming online and people being able to come right to the doorstep with their car to Denali. And that we have this quote from George, one of our directors at the time. How he thought it was a paradox that such a large park would have problems accommodating this relatively small number of people. But he was key to note that it's not the number of people and it's not the number of roads. We don't need to expand the number of roads. That's not our solution. So what was our solution? And if you've been to the park, you know exactly what our solution was. Our solution was to establish the second shuttle system of the national park system to be able to balance that growing demand for visitor opportunities, to tour the road, and to ensure that park resources are protected and visitors continue to have a safe and high quality experience, right? And so up into pre-pandemic era, the national park road had the longest running and most extensive shuttle system of the NPS. But now that, of course, that history is in question, there's a significant rock slide that continues to happen at what we call Pretty Rocks. And there's a discussion about being able to harden this with a substantial bridge, but that will cost a pretty penny. So right now we're on pause for this development. And so we'll just see what happens next. And because we're the national park system and we have this idea, preserve, protect, enjoy, both natural and cultural, because of this story that we just discussed, the Mount McKinley National Park Road is also a historic district for all those reasons, right? For all that story of conservation and that story of the national, where do we want people to have access? Where are cars going to be? And so it continues to convey that a period of collaboration between the Alaska Road Commission and the NPS during that initial road construction, all the way up to the national conversation about Mission 66 and what we should be really preserving. And because we now preserve this as a cultural resource, we are looking at some road characteristic zones. So again, I'm hoping you've visited and these make sense to you. We have that first area, which is the hardened 2-lane road. The second area is widened to be 2 lanes, but then it was never paved. And then as we go further out, it gets more and more what we deem rustic. And so here's that zone 1, just a sample picture, originally constructed between 22 and 25, widened to 2 lanes and paved during Mission 66. It's that zone 2, originally constructed in 31, widened to 2 lanes during Mission 6. And then this is kind of when that national conversation was happening. It widened, national conversation is happening. And then we decide, we won't pave that part. That'll be the compromise. And then in 3, here we go a little bit narrower, originally constructed by 1938. And you can see how we're kind of cinching it in a little bit more. And all the way out near Wonder Lake and Kantishna, we're getting a little bit narrower, originally constructed by 38 and not altered during Mission 66. All right, so what does all of this mean? I know that you all aren't park managers, but I think it's hoping to help you understand when you come and experience a park, we're not what we were at our inception, and we're not what we will be moving forward. We continue to evolve as the resources evolve and the needs of the nation evolve. But just one question, are we possibly loving the parks to death? And not necessarily up here in Alaska. This is more of a lower 48 question. During the pandemic, people realized they could get outside just fine. So some parks went up in visitation by 300%. And so we've had to come up with nationally, we've had to come up with a couple different creative solutions. And they're being piloted now, and people aren't necessarily a fan, but let's just go over a couple of them. Because again, this is something outside of Alaska that we're not necessarily seeing on the daily. So this is Arches. So in Arches this last summer, you had to come on to recreation.gov. You had to figure out when your timed entry was going to be able to get into the park. And you could maybe not get in for the time that you had wanted to visit. And just to show the balance, the visitation was 1.8 million. Here's Glacier National Park, again, completely slammed on the Going to the Sun Road. Again, you have to come onto recreation.gov. But the thing I want to point out here is that you need to do a vehicle reservation available only online. And so if we're discussing about equity and who can have access to the parks, you're looking at somebody, probably if you're on a road trip, you need to have a mobile device, you need to have a smartphone. Not everybody necessarily has a smartphone as much as we think they do. And so are we really balancing equity of access to the parks or not? But I think it's very important to note for Glacier for 2021, their visitation was 3 million, which is a lot for a park with also one road. But just so we don't just talk about roads, we do other things, trails. So this is Zion. This is one of Angel's Landing, a very popular trail in Zion. And they have a lottery system to get access to this trail. Again, recreation.gov, you put in there what you want to do for your lottery, and then you may or may not get it. And then if you get it, you get to finalize your plans and enjoy your hike. But lottery systems, and interesting to go on a hike. But their visitation was over 5 million. So how do we continue to balance the use and protection? We can balance use and protection, but all the while rooted in unimpairment. And I like to speak, again, as a historian, when Conrad Worth, who was the director at the time during Mission 66, he told his team of people who were pretty much reinventing the national park system, this is him. He wanted them to remember the past, analyze the present, and anticipate the future. So I'm hoping as we move forward as a national park system, this is what we keep forefront in the mind, and we continue to provide that access while protecting the resource. So in case, I know that was a lot of information, but here we're going to go one more time. So we went over that evolving background of the national park system. We discussed that dual mandate and how maybe it's not so dual, and the evolution of the NPS sites in Alaska, how Mount McKinley became Denali National Park and Preserve, and then how do we balance that mission of the NPS into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. That was outstanding, and thank you for all that background. That I feel like that was a full-on course on the history of the Park Service and a nice outline of Alaska history. We're going to open it up to questions for both Ava and Heather. Feel free to write questions in the little chat there on the side. There's a question that came in from Rachel Mason, and it's for both Ava and Heather, and it says, what can Alaska parks learn from Scottish or European resource managers' approaches to historic preservation, especially responses to climate change? I think we probably should have our next Historical Society conference in Scotland so we can study this closer, right? That's one solution. But yeah, again, what can we learn from the Europeans about historic preservation?
Well, I'll chip in, but I think that Scotland has been, as far as like climate change, they have a lot of coast, which we do as well, relative to our size. And they have made a point of having a lot of coastal archaeology surveys so that they know the resources that are out there. So, you have to know it before you can preserve it. So they're trying to just keep an account of everything that's out there. So to kind of assess what they need to do next, and then prioritize things that are like really valuable and can yield a lot of important information. And then also understand when some things are just, we can't preserve everything. And know when, sometimes things are valuable as ruins, and sometimes things are valuable as something, that is going away, and we can enjoy it how it is now and record it. But then, it won't be able to save everything.
Yeah, I think that's really well understood. We do also have the same issue with the coastline, of course, and we do a lot of the surveys. We have a lot of National Park Service land that has a lot of coastline. And again, just knowing what you have versus knowing what you don't have, and not being able to own up to say that we can't save all the things, but maybe we can save the information about those things. I think is something that we could look towards more in the future.
I appreciate you bringing up the climate change aspect also, Ava, because that's one thing that also stands out. Heather's presentation really got into how do you manage all these people coming in, Denali having the foresight to put in that shuttle system. And now many of you know that they're having issues with with a lot of people coming in, but they're also having problems with climate change affecting how people can access the road. So it's like this double this double issue where you're like, okay, we're going to continue to figure out solutions to get people into the park while preserving the wildlife and the scenic vistas. But if these landslides keep happening and it's costing millions of dollars to, put a bridge over something to fix that problem, like when's the next landslide coming? There's the management issue is sort of compounded by this, the people and the climate change. And I still think back, when I first started with the Park Services in the early 2010s, and I remember sitting in these meetings where, they're ramping up this planning for the centennial of the Park Service. 2016, it's going to be this exciting time, but the young people don't care. We need to be relevant. And they're coming up with these sort of opt-outside campaigns. Like, how are we going to keep the young people interested in parks? And I don't know if it was like Instagram was like in its infancy. So like, but it's like people showing up has not been a problem for the parks. And they had those campaigns, and they were, I'm sure they were effective. They were collaborating with REI and all these partners to get people, and especially young people, to appreciate the parks. But it's really brought in a whole, and as many of you know, it's even the last 10 years, access to the parks has just really drastically changed, especially in the lower 48, but up here some too. Another question that came in is from Tom. Ava, is there vegetation change due to warming that is changing the look of the Scottish Highlands? Are they trying to respond in some way?
I do not know the answer to this question. I'm sorry. I don't know. I focus more on the coastal climate change and erosion while I was there, but I don't know about the vegetation change.
And because we keep talking about Denali, I know this is one thing that the vegetation's changing there. You're getting alder and willow trees going up the mountainsides that didn't used to be there. Some of the vistas that used to be very open are harder to see from the park road. And that's another management issue is, how much of this historic resource, which is the park road, and how many of these vistas do you protect versus just sort of letting some of this stuff grow up? It's another access versus preservation versus not trying to destroy sort of the evolution of the environment, but you're also you're trying to sort of maintain some of these important vistas for why the road was built in the first place. But yeah, it's a good question. Heather, can you answer your own question that you posed at the end? Or that's just
no, I was hoping to crowdsource, and no one's offering up anything. But I think it's just to say that people come into the parks and they think we know exactly what's going on. And I would just like to counter and say we don't, and we're learning every single day. We're doing our best to keep within that mission of being able to balance protection and use, all while rooted in keeping things unimpaired. But we can learn from everyone. Like, we could learn from Scotland. We could learn from, just because we're the first doesn't make us the best, by the way. But we could do more, and we could go reach out to the public and see what they're more willing to take maybe a compromise on, to then be able to preserve things.
All right. I just realized I have more questions that came in the Ask a Question section. So here we have from Elizabeth Cook. Given that prehistoric site locations are protected, how can they attract historic tourism visitors? And feel free, either of you, to take that on. And it's the ultimate challenge, right? Like, sometimes these archaeology sites, we don't want people poking around, and we don't necessarily want people knowing where they are because they get looted. But also they're really cool and important places that we want to tell part of the story in the historic story. But I guess how do we attract visitors in a way that's responsible?
Yeah, like you said, this is very difficult, but I know along the Denali Highway, there are some signs that tell about the area, like along the trails that you can go. They don't say specific, there's an archaeological site, 20 yards to your right, but it says like this is an archaeological area. So there can be signage or tours. I don't know. I think maybe in more populated areas, there could be more like oversight on it, but especially in Alaska, it's hard when there's really remote locations to monitor the sites to promote only beneficial activities.
Yeah, I've always struggled, and I'm not an archaeologist, but I came up through sort of public history programs where it's kind of like, if we have the history, let's just like talk about it and let's tell people it's there and let's share it. And oftentimes archaeologists, whoa, let's and that's me just sort of being ignorant, not fully understanding like how many looters are actually out there doing their thing. The metal detector people you were talking about in Scotland, Ava, and it's a real issue, and I was pretty ignorant about it, but I don't know the best way forward with this. And Heather, I don't know if you have any ideas about.
Well, I think we also do compromises there too. And so if you go out and visit the parks here in Alaska, you'll see some signage that says this spot was really important for these reasons. It won't give you like there's a house pit over that direction. It'll say like this is what was happening in this landscape 10,000 years ago. Or more specifically, when you look at things like Brooks Camp inside Katmai National Monument, National Park and Preserve, you can tell where my brain typically lives. That has a recreational camp right on top of an NHL archaeological district. And so you're literally standing on thousands of years of history. And so that's interpreted to say what those are. And then there's a subterranean Barabara house exhibit also away from camp for people to understand like really what they're standing on and who's always been here. So there's some compromises. And I think Lower 48 wise, there's specific things that welcome you in to those archaeological sites. So Mesa Verde, you're coming and you're seeing and you're using psychological tricks on the visitors to not then be a looter or not like to say that you're going to help us preserve this too. This is everyone's heritage, so don't take it for yourself. So there's all these different compromises that we try, and again, always looking for new solutions.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Elizabeth. The next question is from David Ramser. It's for Ava, and he says, apologies if I missed this, but can you explain how Scotland funds its tourism campaign and attractions? Are there special taxes on tourism sites, government budget, fees at the sites? Lack of such funding is a long-time problem in Alaska.
So unfortunately, I don't remember all the details on this. So feel free to contact me afterwards and I can just brush up on some of this. But I do know that they have fees for all their sites. They promote memberships and they have many gift shops at like all their locations. So they are a public body. So I'm not sure exactly how much funding they get from the government. But yeah, they definitely make a point of kind of promoting themselves as a business and charging access fees, having memberships.
I've seen several states have creative solutions, whether it's using their lottery. And I think in Colorado, they use part of their lottery. In Texas, they put a tax, I think, on sporting goods that help. Sports is a big deal in Texas, so that helps their part of their historic preservation process. Thanks for that question, David. Another question that came in: are parks initially inventoried for ecological indicators? so human climate changes can be studied over time rather than just at the moment of park designation. And you think about that for a second. Are parks initially inventoried for ecological indicators so human climate changes can be studied over time rather than just at the moment of park designation?
So it's complicated to become a park, especially nowadays. We're effectively running out of land. We're doing a lot of smaller acquisitions, for lack of a better term. But in order to become a park, there's years of study that goes into that land. So ecologists are out there figuring out, is this a special spot that needs to come into the fold of the national park system? I think a really good example would be here in Alaska. And from the 1950s to the 1970s, there was Alaska task force that were set out by the national park system to be able to figure out what those special spots were. And that was mostly based off of ecology to say what these are, but also to talk about the history and the cultural history of those areas. And so we have all those records to start with, like what it was and then what it is now. And in the last 12 years, we've pivoted to, there's an inventory and monitoring program within the national park system for natural resources. We don't have the same on the cultural resources side, but it's people outside of the actual individual parks that are looking at those touchstone indicators for what's changing and what's not changing. And so that's also based off of ecology.
Thanks, Heather. Another question that came in from Brina. Heather, at what point do we, this is a good question for conflict for our theme of the conference. Heather, at what point do we preserve something versus call it an eyesore? Take all the ruins along the Chilkoot Trail left over from the Klondike. Today, if we saw modern relics on the trail, we'd call it litter.
Thank you, Brina. This will be fun. So in general, in the United States, right, we have to let enough time pass for us to figure out if there's a there, right? If there's a story that needs to be preserved, because really that's what the National Register is. It's a list of places that have a story that should be preserved. That's really all it is. So when you're looking at up the Chilkoot, which we lovingly call the longest museum in the world because of the artifact scatter that goes all the way up the mountain, that's part of that significant story. And it was left long enough that no one just threw it out, right? No one needed to use that pass after the gold rush had been completed. And so it was just preserved there and it became part of that National Historic Landmark District. So definitely a high level story. Your Snickers wrapper on the trail, I don't know that that has a good story to tell. We run into a different kind of thought process, especially when we deal with a lot of different military dumps across Alaska. You're like, okay, well, that's a story. We should probably still clean it up because it's full of oil and contaminants, but that's part of the story, right? And so this is again like part of that understanding about what do you take out before it becomes 50 years old is also another discussion that we often have. Or what do you have that should be, again, analyzed, recognized, documented, and then removed? Do you need to keep it on the land to tell that story? Maybe, maybe not. You're muted, Erik.
Thank you. I think I know how to do this by now, but in the comments, John Wachtel, he makes a good point here. Prehistoric sites and access versus preservation protection. There are good examples of online virtual tours that let you experience the site without having to advertise their locations. So potential solution there. It's a great point, John. And also Janet Clemens left a link to climate change page from the Park Service that talks a little bit about climate change strategy. So be sure to check out that link. And I don't see any other questions. And I know we have a little bit more time, but I guess we can just promote things like there's a historic bar crawl this evening. So I encourage people to sign up for that in Anchorage, if you're in Anchorage. And I guess, yeah, there's a lot. Both of you gave us a lot to chew on here. So, I feel like feel free to reach out to the presenters if you have more questions about, what they were talking about. And other than that, do you guys have any other final final thoughts, final statements? All right.
I'll read off the quote,
yeah.
but I
Wonderful.
forgot my final slide on my PowerPoint.
Perfect.
So I'll read that off. It says, this is from the book Managing Built Heritage, The Role of Cultural Values and Significance. And it says that management decisions about the care and use of an asset will only prove to be sustainable in the long term if they have been shaped by a coherent understanding of its wider significance to society and the ways in which that significance has, is, or could yet be compromised by change, misuse, or neglect. That's by Bond and Worthington. And I think that it applies to both of our talks, and just the value of the parks management and our community's understanding how important their heritage is.
Thank you. That was a great quote. And as you said, it just dawned on me. You brought up something in your presentation, Ava, and maybe you don't have all the details, but it was very encouraging to hear what you brought up about UAA potentially starting a program for tourism and cultural heritage. That's exciting. And I don't know if you have any more details on that, or if I can go bother Ian and talk to him about that. But that's exciting to know.
Yeah, he will definitely. He knows all the details on that, and he might be on this call. But yeah, he's been working on that, making some sort of master's program, and making it an interdisciplinary program between the history department, the anthropology, and Alaska Native Studies departments. Yeah, so it should be great. Yeah, I'm excited for it.
That's awesome. All right. Well,
I think the last thing that I would just have to say is just to remind everyone that you're all owners of the public land of the United States. You have stake in this game, as it were, and we're doing this for you. And if you have opinions and you have thoughts that you want to share, we're here to listen to those. Obviously, we can't turn the Titanic on a dime, but we're happy to make changes as we go.
Great point, Heather. Joe also just made a note in the comments. The business meeting, the Alaska Historical Society business meeting this afternoon at 2:00. It's not on Crowdcast, it's on Zoom, and so you have to look at the last page of the program to find the URL for that Zoom link. So just so everyone's aware. And then Karen Brewster just said she was at Zion. She was just at Zion, and there's a permit system for Angels Landing, and shuttle system does little to limit people. And I know Zion, I think I read recently, is the most visited park right now in the system, and so I know they're trying to find solutions for that. So, and
again, Karen, it's that balance of we still are required to provide access, and so at what point, if we didn't have those limiting factors, it would be very interesting to see what would have happened in these last 2 years at Zion's in particular. Because it is actually limiting. Even if it doesn't feel like it is, it's overwhelmed, I'm sure, with the amount of people that are still there. But if it didn't have those limits on it, it would be even more overwhelming. So it's, again, trying to find that balance, and we're not quite sure where that is. We don't want to limit people's access to nature, but you also need to limit that in the fact that you want to keep the nature thriving. So it's hard. There's no easy decision here.
And that's a park that's overrun. I go back to Denali, like they set up that road lottery system to sort of allow people to have that drive their own cars for the several days in September at the end of the season. And it's a great program, and it gets a lot of Alaskans excited about the park. It keeps the park very relevant for especially a lot of the locals. But if you talk to some of the people that are on the ground, wildlife managers, like this could all come crumbling down if people are littering out their cars, and it affects the way they're trying to do their own management. So some people are totally full on, let's get rid of the road lottery, and others and I keep thinking about even that second mission statement you brought up in your presentation, Heather, that it has that word values. And it's like, oh, that's doing a lot, because that values is kind of who's in charge. one superintendent might say, let's get rid of the road lottery, and another might say, no, this is a great opportunity for tourism. And it's also continuing to provide that access that we're trying as a Park Service, as an agency, to provide. Karen, funny. Hiking the Narrows with thousands of other folks, bleach. Yeah, pretty much. All right. Well, thank you, Ava and Heather, and thank you everyone for attending the session this morning. And I guess the next one, I believe, is 11. Come back at 11 for the next session. So thank you, everyone.